Bridges to Life was created, Restoring Peace and a program was created as a prison ministry with John's own journey at heart, and takes victims into prison as well as those that's not been victims of crime, and they share stories, and then we break down into small groups. It's over a 14-week session is what was created. So we're going to be talking about that program today and answering your questions, and we have a table. But John concluded in his studies that, now we're just going to be rough on our estimates here because everybody heard the term recidivism. They return within 3 years of their leaving prison, they come back, and it counts into recidivism rate. And it's all over, I think with the halfway house that Father Ron talked about, 7% is awesome because the national rate is somewhere up. Anybody know the rate? 7. 60, 70% somewhere. So we'll just give the benefit of the doubt. John Sage said, we'll just go with 50%. 50%. John concluded that means that half of our future prison population are with us now. What are we going to do about it? There are several areas that you're here to learn about today that you can get involved inside prisons. Many of you are involved in prisons, and Bridges to Life is just another opportunity to get involved in prison. And when we go into prison, we have 14 weeks, first week's orientation, last week's graduation. There's 12 weeks. It's a 2-hour session. That's 24 hours that you're with these men or women. We do it at the women's prison as well. We're in 6 adult facilities and a juvenile here in Indiana, 67 in Houston, Texas, and we're throughout other parts of the nation as well. But here in Indiana, we have opportunity for you to get involved and serve. But when we break, after a speaker speaks the first half of the class, we then break down into 4 small groups, and in that small group, we discuss the principles of the program. It's based on faith in God, the power of our story, like John's story and the offender story, and then the principles of the program, which is responsibility, accountability, confession, repentance, reconciliation, and the gospel is facilitated through these experiences, and it's very powerful. So at this time, I want to introduce the regional coordinator for our program here in Indiana, Misty Wallace, and she's coming to you today to share her story that she shares in prison. So this is the story. So
good afternoon. I want to thank Deacon Mike for having us here this weekend. Deacon Mike has been a volunteer inside the IREF facility, which is now closed, so I am very grateful. I miss him very much, and I want him to come back. So help me out, guys. I'm going to share with you my testimony today. I was a senior in high school. I was 18 years old. I was headed to play college softball. On October 18th, 1992, my life changed forever. I was out with some friends on the southwest side of Indianapolis. We were out having a good time, went to dinner, did a few haunted houses. It was that time of the year, this time of the year. And my boyfriend and I had gotten into an argument, so we decided to split ways. I dropped him off at home. I was angry when I left. We drove up Kentucky Avenue because, believe it or not, we did not have cell phones at that time. 25 years ago, I pulled over to use a payphone. When I pulled into the payphone area, I pulled right up next to the booth. I was in my neighborhood. I was around my home. I felt comfortable. I felt like I knew everyone. I felt safe because that was my side of town, people I knew. I was comfortable. I never even thought twice. I got out, I used the payphone. The first phone call I made home was to my parents to let them know I was going over to a friend's house. Well, my parents didn't answer the phone that night, so I made another phone call to my boyfriend to call and tell him, hey, don't call and wake my mom and dad up. I'm going over to a friend's house. As I'm on the phone with him, I noticed that a car had pulled through the back of the Burger King restaurant up towards the front door. A gentleman had exited the passenger side of the vehicle and walked towards the back end of my car, and he asked me how long I was going to be. And I said, just a few minutes. And my boyfriend said, who's that? I said, someone that wants to use the payphone. He said, okay, call me when you get to Jeanette's. I said, okay. I hung up the phone, and as soon as I turned around, He stuck a gun to my left cheek, pulled the trigger. The bullet went through my left cheek, down through my esophagus, severed the tip of my carotid artery, which I did not know at the time, bounced up my esophagus, and lodged in between the muscle and broke the top 2 vertebrae in my neck. My body automatically went into shock, and my head landed underneath the front tire of my vehicle. All I could think about while I was underneath my vehicle was, please God, don't let this car start, because I left my keys in the ignition and my purse on the seat, because I was safe. As I'm laying underneath my car, trying to move my body, which was not working, a few seconds later, I seen him exit my vehicle, and he walked away. I said, please help me. But he left me there to die. A few seconds later, a gentleman that was working a shift at Rolls-Royce during Desert Storm got called into a shift on a Saturday night, working a shift that they had to pay him big money to be on. Got called in, his last name was Williams, he was the last one on the list, went into work that night, ran some tests. They brought some sand over from Saudi Arabia, and they needed to send these jet engines, our military jet engines, through the sand to make sure that our jets could handle it. So he was in there doing that testing. He got done early. He left early. He pulled out a Rolls Royce, which he's been doing for many, many years. For some reason, he turned left that night. He always goes right to get on 70 to go home. He came up Tibbs Avenue to Kentucky Avenue. He drove past my body laying on the side next to the pay booth. He pulled in because it looked kind of odd to him why my body was just laying on the ground. He pulled around, shined his headlights on me, he came up on me. At that point, I had somehow gotten myself turned over, on my back, which was not a good idea. I was choking and gurgling in my own blood. He called 911. He said, I'm going to be right here by your side, and we're going to get through this. I'm not leaving your side. They'll be here shortly to get you. He happened to be a Vietnam vet, American Red Cross trained in everything possible, and a pastor in a church in Mooresville. He stayed by my side. The paramedics got there. Was transferred to Wishart Hospital in Indianapolis. Had a very long surgery, several hours. But before I went into surgery, let me go back a little bit. Before I went into surgery, they took me into the small room. And I knew I was bad, but I wasn't for sure how bad I was. But they weren't, I couldn't really hear them anyways because I had this ringing in my ears. But they weren't really communicating with me as much as I could tell. They were communicating with my family. But I knew how bad I was when I was in the small room, and I looked up, and my mom and my dad, my brothers, my sister, and my grandparents were leaning over me, and they were saying goodbye. They told my mom and dad at that point that if I lived through surgery, which I probably wouldn't because the artery was severed and my head was twice the size already. And they said if I did, I wouldn't walk again because the vertebrae, the bones were now floating in my spinal fluid, and I probably wouldn't walk if I did live. Several hours through surgery, I woke up on a ventilator in a drug-induced coma, life support for 3 days. Day 4, I went to a regular room, and day 7, I went home. I left the hospital, I had a lot of recovery, a lot. I'd been home recovering about a month to the day, about a month since I'd been shot, so we're looking around November 17th, 18th area. And I needed to get out of the house because I was getting stir crazy and everybody was coming to visit. I just kind of wanted to get out and get some fresh air, so I decided I was going to go visit my grandfather who was diagnosed with cancer. And I remember getting in the car that night. I had staples still in the back of my ear all the way down to my throat, big neck brace, and the bullet stayed lodged in my neck for 2 years. So I lost my scholarship to play softball. So my life was on a total different journey than I had planned it my senior year. That night when I drove to my grandfather's house, I came to the intersection of Vermont and Lyndhurst on the southwest side of Indianapolis. Indianapolis is a pretty decent-sized city. What are the odds that I come to the stoplight and I'm face-to-face with the vehicle that pulled into the Burger King restaurant that night? Sitting across from me at the stoplight, I told him, I said, that's the car. And the guy driving the car is the guy that shot me. We followed him to a gas station. I wrote down his license plate number. He went in, got a pop, and came back out and got in his car. I went to my grandfather's house. I called my detective. The next morning, they went to his house. They questioned him about a shooting, his car, and a shooting at a payphone booth, and it involved a girl. And he, like many other offenders, said, "I didn't do it. It wasn't me. You got the wrong person." That led to a jury trial that led to, it was 2 days, but I know they can last forever, but that 2 days was long enough. The second day of the trial, it was about 11 o'clock at night. The jury came back hung 11-1. The judge was tired too, obviously. He said, "Please go back and review the evidence. I want to clear this case up tonight. I don't want to go in the next day." Thank goodness, because they went back in and they convinced that one person that he was guilty. So they came back out with a guilty verdict. He was sentenced to 20 years in the state of Indiana for attempted murder and carrying a handgun in the state of Indiana without a license. They threw out auto theft because the starter went out on my car that night and it had to be towed from the crime scene. They threw out robbery because they never found my purse. He went to prison. I got married. A very short time later, moved to California. I was 2,000 miles away from home, living my new life. Now, I'd been shot, I graduated high school, I got married, I went to court, jury trial. I get to California, my whole life does a halt. Nothing. Well, I found myself in the ER probably 5 nights out of the week. I was suffering from post-traumatic stress syndrome. I was having panic attacks. My mental health got so bad that they sent me to see a naval psychologist at the Naval Hospital in San Diego. As I was out there trying to keep myself awake, because they over-medicated me, I believe, trying to stay awake, suffering and having these panic attacks, I was miserable. I got so bad that they ended up giving my husband honorable discharge from the United States military because of my mental health. Sent us back to Indianapolis so I could recover. Got back to Indianapolis, started a life, had my first child 2 years later. Living life, doing the things I'm supposed to be doing. And probably about 8 years being home, just living life, I get a letter from the Indiana Department of Corrections saying my offender was being released. I was mad. I was mad. I was like, this is not true. Someone's going to give me some answers. I called them constantly. I got a lady that answered the phone one day, and finally she said, "Well, you can file for a restraining order, but since, don't get your hopes up, because he's been incarcerated for 8 years and 8 months, so they might not give you this, but you can file for it." I did get a court date that day, but I forgot. I had to go back to court, and I had to face him again. I remember that day like it was yesterday. I remember being in the basement of the city-county building. I was very sick. I was vomiting in and out of the restroom. My youngest brother was with me that day. I went in and out of the restroom. I looked over the candy machine, and as soon as I looked up, my brother was getting a candy bar out of the candy machine because he's like, "I didn't have lunch and it's going to be a long afternoon." As soon as I looked up, I could see my offender walking towards me down the hallway, and he walked right up to me and he asked me where the courtroom was. And I looked over at my brother, and I thought he was going to choke on his candy bar. He was so mad. I just pointed down the hall, and he went to the courtroom, said thank you, and walked on. I walked over to my brother, and I said, "Let's go. I don't want to be here." And he goes, "What are you talking about?" I was like, "I don't want to be here." He said, "What are you doing?" "No, you went through all this to get here, and I'm going to stay right here by your side, and we're going to get through this together." So we went into the courtroom, and I think that day, what mainly hit me the most is I felt like he didn't even know who I was. He didn't even know what he took away from me. I went into the courtroom that day, and I believe the judge just kind of seen it all over my face. She granted the restraining order for a year. So as I was leaving the courtroom that day, my offender said, "Your Honor, can I say something to Misty?" And as soon as he started to say my name, my brother erupted in the courtroom and said, "Hush your mouth. Don't say anything to my sister. There's nothing that you can say that will ever make this right. Don't talk to my sister." So it kind of got chaotic-y, and they took him off to a little room. And then we left the courtroom that day, and I have to say, for many years, I always wondered, was he going to tell me he was sorry for shooting me in the head? That was hard to accept because I was still angry. I was still mad. I went on with my life. I now have a second child several years later, and went through a divorce. I started having problems in my own life, got to a dark part in my life where I didn't want to be here anymore either. I got done with people taking from me, living on my own for the first time with 2 kids after a horrible divorce. And while I was living on my own, I had my niece come over because I was working a couple jobs to watch my kids one night because I got called into work. So my niece said, yeah, Misty, I'll come over and watch the kids. So she comes over and she brings a couple friends with her. Went to work that Monday and I came home to an empty house. Her friends needed their drug money a little bit more than I guess I needed my personal items. That was my breaking point. That was my breaking point. I called my ex-husband. I said, can you come and get the kids? I'm not feeling well. I knew what my intentions were. He didn't know. He said, okay, I'll come and get him, and he did. I went in the kitchen and I got a knife. And I sat in the floor and I made a phone call. I made one phone call and I called the same guy that pulled over on October 18th, 1992 and stayed by my side. I called him and he baptized me in his church in October 2005. His name's Tim Williams. And I don't know where everyone is with angels, but he's my angel. He's always there, always there. I picked myself up. I started going on with my life. It had been over that year that restraining order was lifted. I was never bothered. Nothing was ever done. No one ever picked on me or, I always looked over my shoulder anyways. But I felt more comfortable in my life at that point. And then I started dealing with, being baptized in the Bible and forgiveness. That was hard. I was like, no, that's not going to happen. But I knew that I had to. And I knew once I learned more about forgiveness, the one thing that I took away with that is that I don't ever have to forget what happened to me. But I was forgiving so I could move forward in my life, which I was not doing very well. And once I decided to release that forgiveness, I took it a step further. I looked him up on Facebook, and I sent him a message. And I said, I am no longer angry. I am not mad. Well, first I said, I know you know who I am. I am no longer angry. I'm no longer mad. I have forgiven you. So at this point, I'm going to call up my shooter who is here with us today. He's also my friend. He's a chaplain in the Indiana Department of Corrections, Keith Blackburn. He's also my partner with Bridges to Life.